So welcome to this afternoon session, Hate Marches to Social Exclusion Zones, the Limits Protest. You've met me already, my name's Ella Whelan. Really delighted to be chairing this session, which is, all of the sessions in Living Freedom have some relationship to contemporary political battles, but this is probably the one that feels most close in terms of the fact that this is a very real dilemma happening on a daily basis, it seems like a daily basis at the moment, where the limits of protest lie. And I think it's important to note how different protest seems to be in the minds of lots of people today. So rather than your stereotypical group of people with placards making their cases heard, we now have everything from papier-mâché lizards in Trafalgar Square arguing for climate change to paint being spilled in various places, and also on the more serious side, open expressions of the potential of calls for physical violence, and I think it's fair to say a serious amount of hatred in lots of those marches, and indeed places where protest didn't previously happen on such a mass scale, whether that's outside hospitals, abortion clinics, or particularly in schools, it's now become a commonplace thing. So there is, I believe in the right to protest, the freedom to protest, but even those with even the most absolute views can understand that there is a tricky situation to deal with here, and it's worth talking about rather than just talking in abstract, talking about the reality of what we're dealing with. So that's why we're going to talk about it, and I'm very excited that we have two speakers here who are, I think it's fair to say, on somewhat opposite sides, or at least there's a lot of distinction between them on what they think about this issue and going to battle it out. They've got illustrious biographies in your handbook, which you should look up, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly introduce them as Jan Macvarish, sat here next to me, who is the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union, which is a very exciting organisation you should talk to Jan about in the break. And to the left of me here, Kevin Rooney, who's the Academy of Ideas Education Forum member and editor of a really great website called irishborderpoll.com, which was set up in the interest of promoting discussions about an Irish border poll to a audience outside of the immediacy of Ireland, and some really great articles on there. You should talk to Kevin about it, as well as being an author of various books, both of them. So we're going to each give them 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll get down to it. So Jan, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you. Thanks, Ella. Okay, so how many of you have been on a political protest of some kind? Oh, okay, that's complete opposite of what I thought would happen. Interesting. Well, I can see the Canadians are here, so they probably have been on certain protests, but the others I wouldn't be able to predict which ones you've been on, so that's interesting. We can find out later. So how I'm coming at this, as Ella said, I work for the Free Speech Union, and while I think the question of whether speech should be free is fairly simple, actually, once you've accepted that we all have a responsibility to face up to the multiplicity of ideas that are out there in the world. That's my kind of starting point when it comes to freedom of speech. Although this doesn't mean that we're obliged to pay attention to those ideas or listen to them all of the time, but we should be willing to know that they exist, and if we're fully engaged with the world, we ought to face up to and challenge those ideas which we think are particularly destructive. Now, that sort of covers what I do professionally, so I would emphasise today, though, that I'm speaking in my private capacity rather than speaking for the Free Speech Union. I'm speaking as someone, I think, today who's very concerned about the state of civic life and its relationship to political and individual freedom. I should also say that I'm not a lawyer, and while I think the multiple and complicated laws covering either freedom of expression or freedom of association are definitely worth exploring and understanding to unearth the kind of principles that underpin society's historical thinking when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of protest. I don't think there's sufficient guides for the kind of thinking that we need to do. It can get very technical when you try and understand what the law's up to when it comes to policing protest. And I think we need to think more about not just how political protest should be regulated or not regulated, but probably more importantly, how it should be conducted, where, when and why, especially if we're the kind of people who might want to make a change in society. So the question of the freedom to protest is a much more complicated one to me than the question of freedom of speech, even though it all tends to get bundled up together in law and often in practice as well. So if you've been aware of the stories about the Metropolitan Police trying to discern on the large anti-Israel stroke pro-Gaza protest whether someone should be prosecuted for holding a placard with political figures depicted as coconuts on it, which as a recent case was in the press, or how the temporary damage to property caused by paint or dust on a painting or on Stonehenge or on a snooker table should be policed and prosecuted, or in the pulling down of the Samuel Colston statue in Bristol back in 2020, you'll know that the decisions being made by the police and by the criminal justice system can often seem incomprehensible to normal people, and including to me and to lots of us who are very concerned about free speech. So it's a really complicated area. And I think that there's some interesting things to pull out of it. And I think whenever we talk about the right to protest, we're raising questions really about speech and behaviour, about what is political action to affect change, and what is just the mobilisation of voices and bodies to disrupt the lives of other people and to express a feeling. For example, if you're shouting through a megaphone outside a speaking event, which you oppose, when does your speech become noise? And then when does that noise become physical behaviour that actually obstructs the speaking of others? When does it represent the expression of your views? And when does it obstruct or silence the speech of others? When does it intimidate those attending such that they're deterred from taking part in political life on other occasions? And this happens all the time. So I've got multiple cases that I won't bring in because I haven't got time. You'll notice that in the recent pro-Gaza, anti-Israel campus protests, noise-making as a form of protest has become very common. Repetitive chanting, screaming, banging of pots and pans and drums. But this is often accompanied by the covering of mouths by masks and by a refusal to account for themselves to those who ask questions. So there's this weird contradiction between noise-making and the refusal to speak. And I think we can explore that kind of thing because that tells us something about what's going on in what looks like political action and what looks like protest today. So some of the confusions, the further confusions that arise, I think, is protesters will often say today, I can do no other. When the world is burning, when there's a genocide, when there are babies being killed inside a clinic, I can do no other. I must be here, I must speak, you ought to join me and we should all take action. But I would say that we shouldn't confuse the form of protest, that which looks familiar to us because historically protest has looked this way, with the content and the intent of the protesters. And I think going back to what Stephanie said this morning and Tim as well about Arendt and Kant respectively, I think this is not, a lot of what's going on at the moment is not political action in the way that Stephanie outlined in her explanation of Arendt. And neither is it moral action in the way that Tim outlined in his exposition on Kant. I think the justification for many contemporary protests is a must, not an ought, as though there's no choice involved. And then there's no reason given by which self-restraint or responsibility should be exercised. And I think you can elevate this all the way along to the justifications for Hamas's actions, which are almost understood by a lot of people, I think, as some kind of protest, as a resistance or a protest. So I want to come on to just one example because I think that's all we've got time for, really. And I use this example because it's the one that I think I've thought most about and I've changed my mind on quite a long time ago. And that's the one of buffer zones outside abortion clinics. And I'm very pro-protest and I'm very pro-choice. But I think that so the buffer zones determine that there's a certain boundary within which activities of the protest or persuasive type cannot take place. Now that ended up with what we see today, which is people standing in silent prayer as individuals to test the buffer zone law. But actually what was being responded to when the law came into place was large protests by large groups with images, hymn singing and megaphones. The prayers say, we can do no other. This is such a matter of conscience for me. I can do no other, I must be here. And I often think, maybe it's slightly glib, I often think, well, if you really thought there was a genocide of babies going on inside that clinic, silent prayer may be rather inadequate as a response, and maybe you should try and get inside. But then, of course, you realise you can't go inside because you can't actually rescue those babies because they're inside women, and that's the whole dilemma of abortion or autonomy. So, and the question I would raise there is, what are the women, their partners and their families when they are entering a clinic? What are the staff when they go there every day to carry out their legal work? Are they really in a position to enter into a political or moral dialogue about abortion at that moment, in that place? Are they entitled to privacy and dignity? Those women have no choice but to access care there, whereas the prayers could do it anywhere. So I think I want to pose that as a dilemma, because it's often one that's very difficult for free speechers, and certainly within the Free Speech Union, it's not one that we agree on. And so the additional element here I wanted to sort of raise here is that I don't understand why pro-life people who oppose buffer zones in the name of free speech and freedom of conscience will not criticise those who protest outside abortion clinics. And this is why I want us to consider the responsibility of those who protest to actually self-police. So while there's important considerations of law and policing and criminal justice, there's an equal onus on those of us who wish to change society to consider what is demanded of us as citizens who consider all of society to actually partake in political action that isn't just an expression of our inner needs, what we think is our conscience, in isolation from the rest of society.
Brilliant, thank you, Jan. And now Kevin.
And Ella, thanks for inviting me. Let me just say out loud 4 wee things I always think about and say to myself. I have done for many years, and it partly guides what I think about the right to protest and freedom. And then, because it's such a brilliant blurb, Ella, I want to then go through the blurb and tell you what I think, yes or no, about those little questions posed. So number one, what's your model of a human being? My model of a human being is somebody who's robust, resilient, rational and reasoned. So that's my starting point when I start to think about protest. The second question I always ask myself is, why is it that 90.9% of laws that are made today in relation to free speech or protest are about restricting the protest, and free speech never ever about extending freedom? So that's at the back of my mind as well. And the third thing is, and I know it's fairly evident and obvious to you, but arguing for the right to protest or for freedom is always much harder when you really dislike the people you're trying to defend. And that's something else that sticks in my mind. And the fourth thing is that I think, like some other people, that being offended or being hurt or insulted is not sufficient grounds to expect someone else's free speech or the right to protest to be banned or restricted or censored. So that's my little guiding principles. Tricky dilemma, it said, tricky dilemma. That was the thing that jumped out at me from the blurb, because some of them are really tricky dilemmas. Do you know, young English people and Bulgarian people and people from different countries, that where I come from today, in Belfast, it's the 12th of July. And it's a very, very big, famous day where the Orange Men, the Protestants, the Unionists marched to celebrate the victory of King Billy. And what they used to do, especially in the past, was walk through Catholic areas and coat trail and let the Fenians, the Catholics, know that they were second-class citizens. It's not the exact same, but parallels to Ku Klux Klan, or wanting to walk through a black area or whatever. Although it's a little bit different. Long and short, there's a march today up the Shankill Road going past another Catholic estate called Ardoyne. It's been banned. It's been banned because the Catholic residents don't want it going by. The Protestants and Orangemen want the right to march. Discuss, what do we do? Now, I'm from a Catholic background, and I've written several articles in Spiked over the years defending the right of the Orangemen to march. But some of the people in that march will have been murderers, part of loyalist paramilitary groups, who murdered, shot dead some Catholics in that estate, Ardoyne, where they're marching by. What do you do? Question mark. It's a friggin' tricky dilemma. So as much as you might have guiding principles, etc., you still come across real difficulties. So let's get to the Palestinian demos. I think I've seen the phrase hate marches used. I mean, I hope I don't come across as unsophisticated, but I absolutely unconditionally defend the right to march. And I do think we get into an interesting discussion about who labels something a hate march. I think we get into an interesting discussion about who gets to define and label something intimidation or harassment. Those are things that we can work out. So, by the way, the proscribed organisations, the Hamas, this becomes a really interesting dilemma. Of course, I've been on marches with certain people in this room where the proscribed organisation was the IRA, where lots of people were shouting out in support of, including myself. So just because someone's a proscribed organisation, in and of itself, for me, is not sufficient grounds to ban that march. And then you go on to the next one. The blurb is really brilliant. The school gates. I don't know how familiar young people are with the Michaela school incident, where they banned where the prayer ban was implemented, and Muslim parents protested outside the school gates. And lots of people say it's wrong to protest outside school gates. Absolutely defend the right of those Muslim parents to protest. It's never ever nice protesting, especially outside of school where kids go to. But my argument there is that we should be able to find a way where the teachers and pupils and anyone else are able to go in and out of that school. And even though it can be very distasteful to be protesting outside of school, I think those people have the right to do that. Just like I defend the parents in Birmingham, the Muslim parents, who weren't happy about trans and certain sexual issues being discussed in the curriculum with their kids, where they thought they had no control of and it was being slipped in without their approval. I'm not saying I agree with the content of what the parents were protesting about, but I'm fairly comfortable defending the right to do that. Buffer zones, John's far more intelligent and eloquent than me, but there's just a visceral gut instinct in me that defends...
Like the victim.
I hope it works. I just defend absolutely the right of people to protest against abortion. The buffer zones thing to me, it's not even a dilemma. That's a scary thing, Ella. It's so straightforward. So please put me right about why I might be so wrong. Defend it absolutely unequivocally. And this thing about John's got a really where I think John's really interested in that. Effectively, I think, she correct me if I'm wrong, she was redefining those people as patients, as medical patients going in and out. I think that's what she was getting at. And I accept that becomes a little bit tricky. But I don't fully accept that. In a way, I'm slightly torn on that, but I don't think either way it's sufficient reason for me to not defend the right of people to want to oppose abortion. The clock is going to beat me. I think that then I don't have time to go through the rest of the blurb, so let me just finish by saying, yeah, I'll just shut up, Ella.
No, you can have one more.
I've just lost the thread. Yeah, I think maybe the blurb was hinting at about, you know, the problem with some protesters that they're a threat to freedom. I'm not sure. I want to be a bit more. Can people raise where they think the protests are actually a threat to freedom? Because to me, it's often not a threat to feeling. It might be insulting to some people, offensive to some people that might not like it. But I don't see how a lot of the protests that we're talking about are a direct threat to people's freedom. Final thing I forgot, Ella. I have much less sympathy for those people on the campuses. I find a lot of their protests immature and a bit silly. And, you know, if they want to protest on campus, I almost think, well, I'm sure we can find a way where they've got the right to protest, but they haven't got the right to block students and lecturers going into their lectures and back and forth, and so on and so forth. I'll shut up and we'll maybe come back to some of the cut and thrust of debate.
Right, I want to come out to people, but just before I do that, I just actually want to abuse my position as chair and ask you both just a quick question to sort of clarify some things. Jan, I just wanted to ask you, do you think the problem is a kind of, you know, really a mission, people's issue with the clampdowns on protests is that it's a mission creep. So, you know, for example, the argument against buffer zones, one of the arguments against buffer zones is that you will see buffer zones proliferate in society in other areas. You know, we've had, obviously, discussions about buffer zones outside MPs' houses, pretty understandable, but then outside constituency offices, outside the Houses of Parliament, and it's the slippery slope argument. is, you know, how much does that concern you? Because a bit like what Tamandra was saying around in her lecture about digital technology and online safety bill and things like that, we do have this tendency to give a mile when all was originally asked for was an inch.
Yeah, I think that's the slippery slope argument always seems very persuasive, but then you end up with, you can do nothing then. So you're always going to go back to the point of zero, because anything's the first point on a slippery slope, whereas we have laws about all kinds of things. And I don't think protest is unconditionally allowed in law anyway. It's already very restricted in lots of different ways. And also it's permitted and it's facilitated as it happens. The law facilitates which maybe Mark will talk about later, but the police facilitate protest. So I don't think that being told you can't protest there is the same as being told you can't protest. If you ban, this particular organisation around a schools issue from ever protesting anywhere, I would absolutely oppose that. But if you say, children going to school, they have to go to that school every day and come out in and out of the gates twice a day. Patients at a clinic or at a hospital have to go to that hospital. They can't choose where else they go. All the choice is on the protesters' side, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to force them to go somewhere else. And that, in the case of the abortion clinics, it's 50 metres, 150 metres down the road. It's nothing. It's no inconvenience other than this kind of symbolic value to it. And so I think what we need is clarity about the difference between citizens in general in life, when we're free to participate in civic life, and patients and children. That might be a useful way to draw the distinction.
Great, thanks. And Kevin, I just wanted to ask you about, I think most people's problem with where protest is bleeding into areas where I suppose you might imagine it shouldn't, whether it's the school gates or in the middle of universities where people are living on greens and things like that. Is that a symptom of, isn't it just a symptom of a shrinking public square? Whereas previously you would have, a realm in which political life was active, a better version of Speaker's Corner that hasn't become so sort of silly, but that would be where political life happened. And then you would have sort of protected, sacred places where, political life was kept at bay for quite sensible reasons. And isn't that worth defending, that distinction?
If I get you right, and tell me if I get you wrong, I agree that there's all sort of shrinkage of political life and even a degeneration of political life in some respects. And I thought one of the things that Jan said was really interesting, which is talking about the mobilisation of voices and bodies, devoid of any real agency or political content, is what I think she was getting at. And I sort of have sympathy for that, but that doesn't, for me, detract from the fact that, for example, I'm a teacher. And we teachers were standing outside the school gates for a few times this past 12 months protesting. And it's the school gates which I think was the right place to protest, because you were actually trying to convince certain teachers not to go in, who were actually going to go in and undermine the rest of us. And I think when it comes to the Michaela school ban, or it comes to the protest in Birmingham, I think I find no reason persuasive as to why they shouldn't be allowed to have their protest at the school gates. I'm up for convincing, but so far I haven't heard a good argument about why they should be denied the right to protest at the school gates or wherever the case may be.